We'll ask three of our interment speakers to talk to about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we will have about 30 to 40 minutes questions. The questions can both be specific questions to the technologies that each of the speakers will talk about, but also, and this is definitely part of the idea of the talk, we want to question them about societal and other changes that the new technologies they're talking about may introduce to us. So I will start by introducing our first speaker. Professor Pablo Ortegon is the director of the Catalan Institute of Nanoscience and Nanotechnology, also known as ICN2. His work focuses on developing methods for the first principle stimulation of materials and their applications to problems in nanoscience. His bio goes on with considerable achievements after that, but I'll just stop at that point and give the time to Pablo. Let me just... Yes.
Okay, so thank you, Ivan. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me share the screen with you for the presentation. Okay, you can see it now?
Yes.
All right, so as Ivan was saying, I work in the development of simulation methods. By training, I'm a theoretical physicist, half theoretical physicist, half quantum chemist. So I'm not an engineer. I don't work on development of materials, but the methods that people use to develop these materials. So what I'm going to talk about is a very general view from our community of developers of how we see this the evolvement of this kind of methods with theoretical methods. So this has been done mainly in the context of a European project, MAX, which is a very nice project that funds the development of ab initio methods for materials development based on high-performance computing. And I will give you some idea of that during the talk. So let's see if I can change. Yeah. So, I mean, this is a materials community, so I don't need to stress the importance of developing materials, but materials are very important for mankind. This is a typical slide of people doing their business every day, but we must realize that in every aspect of our life we have materials that make a function for us, from materials for implants and pacemakers and electronics, GPS, in cars, cosmetics, nanoparticles, everything that we do as a society is based on materials. So it's very important to develop new materials for new functions. And we need, again, new materials for everything, from energy harvesting, conversion, efficiency, health and medicine, environmental protection. Everything that we do every day is based on materials. And we need new materials for more sustainable technologies, more for fixing and for, let's say, solving the societal challenges that we are posed with every day. But the material discovery has been quite based on intuition and kind of not really blind, but not really smart search, and often by serendipity. So I'm going to give you two examples, which you, of course, know very well. So the first one is Edison. He searched for thousands of materials for the first electric lighting. So finally, he settled for one, but he had to explore many materials for his idea of the electric bulb. And the other example is the development of the catalysts to synthesize ammonia by Haber and Bosch. That was a particular material, which was osmium, but then BASF tried to obtain better catalysts for this reaction, and Mitash, he explored like 22,000 materials to get the ion-based catalyst that we still use today. So that was a tour de force, and that was very expensive and very time-consuming. So the hope is that supercomputers or computers and simulation methods can ease this process of material discovery for us. So we don't need to experimentally synthesize and test our steel materials, so that we are able to do it with computational methods that may be faster, maybe not, maybe they are not faster, but they provide understanding, and they guide us very much to find materials more easily than with experiments. And I'm putting here just one example of that connected to this issue of the synthesis of ammonia and looking for catalysts for that. So in the last 20 years, there have been many groups working on materials for catalysis. And of course, Jens Norkopf is one of the main people making contributions there. In 2009, they developed a particular catalyst which is more efficient than the ones that were being used before, more efficient and less expensive, so with more common materials. And that's one of the main successes of the kind of methods we develop for material discovery. So all these possibilities of material science, material design by computation have become a field on itself, this computational material design field, which is really being quite successful and potentially very, very important for the future of material development. And one of the reasons for this to be so powerful or so, promising is that the power of these methods is really growing very, very quickly. So 30, 40 years ago, doing a simulation was not so much trusted. I mean, you could make simulations and calculations, but at the end you had to check the experiment and see if the simulation was right. And usually when there was a disagreement, typically was the simulation that was wrong. Now the situation is much different. This is an exaggeration, of course, but now people trust much more in the simulation because they are much more able to reproduce reality and to predict reality than some years ago. So the situation now in terms of materials modeling has really changed so much. This is again an example of how materials modeling has evolved. So back in the 50s, there were only structural models of maybe this is the example of DNA by Watson and Crick. Their model was not even a computer model; it was just a structural model based on balls and sticks. Of course, that has tremendously evolved. Right now, we have the computer simulations of, in particular in biology, for instance. This is the case of this field of computational biology that really has flourished and that has brought us to a situation in which computational simulation in biology is essential for drug design, for instance. And this is a guy that got the Nobel Award in 2013 for developing multi-scale approaches for complex chemical systems, and in particular in biological systems. This Michael Levitt. So let me put one of a picture of the speech of Michael Levitt when he obtained the Nobel Prize. He was showing this slide showing the evolution of the computers since 1967 to 2013, which was when he obtained the Nobel Award. So the change in cost, in speed, in memory, and in size, and that time it was about a factor of 10,000 for each of these. Okay, so he was making the point that if that would have happened in the car industry, you could buy a Volvo that would cost $3, have a top speed of 1 million kilometers per hour, carry 50,000 people, and you could park it in a shoebox. So the evolution of computer science has been tremendous compared to other fields in human technology. So that, of course, has been very important in bringing this situation that I was mentioning of how well can we trust on simulations currently compared to 30 or 40 years ago. But besides that, you have to take into account another thing that was mentioned in this Nobel talk by Levitt, which is that you can simplify simulations as much as possible, but not much than possible. And this is a sentence that is ascribed to Einstein. Maybe it's not really by Einstein, but probably he made some remarks similar to this, that you should make things as simple as possible, but not simpler. And there are many cases in which in material research and in material exploration, you cannot be too simplistic. And the models that people use have to be sufficiently refined to reproduce reality and to predict reality well enough. And that's why many people, like myself, are working on developing the best possible approaches to describe reality in materials, which is going to the microscopic level and going to the very detailed level of what the nuclei and the electrons are doing. So you have to solve the quantum mechanical equations for the electrons, and from that you understand how the material works, how the atoms move, and so on. Of course, this is very expensive. You have to resort to quantum mechanics, and this is a picture of Paul Dirac that wrote in one of his papers that the fundamental law of science, laws necessary for the mathematical treatment of large part of physics and the whole of chemistry are completely known. This was 100 years ago. But the difficulty lays on the fact that the application of these laws leads to equations which are too complex to be solved. And we have been struggling with that for 100 years. And I think now we can safely say that the situation has very much changed because of two components. The first one is what I already mentioned about the power of computers. Having computers that can solve these equations numerically has been really instrumental, but there is also the contribution of methods to simplify these equations. So we are still solving the quantum mechanical equations, but you use theories like density functional theory, which allow us to do it with a cost which is much, much less than solving the equations, the original equations exactly, let's say. And Walter Kohn is one of the people that have developed methods like density functional theory, which really allow us to do that. And again, the other situation is that we have now computers which are really incredibly powerful. This is a picture of the evolution of the supercomputing. This is in particular in the US, but in other parts of the world it's the same thing. And we are moving now to an era which is being called the exascale era, where you can do calculations with exaflop speed, so 10 to the 18 floating point operations per second, which is something which is really unbelievable, astronomical. The same amount of power you have with data storage and the communication speed and so on. So this brings us to the situation which now we are enjoying. We have simulation and modeling as one of the three approaches to do science besides experiment and theory. And that's based on two different kinds of ways of doing simulations. One is doing very quick and very powerful simulations with high performance computing. So we use the speed and the massive capacity of computers to do simulations which were previously not possible. But the other way is high throughput computing. So make many calculations to explore very large parts of the phase space of materials. So explore different materials to do a particular application. And let me show you one particular example of this high throughput computing search by one of the persons which is involved in this MAX project that I mentioned before, which is a massive search of possible two-dimensional materials by exfoliation of three-dimensional material. So in this case, Nicola Marzari and his collaborators, they have explored thousands of materials and seeing which ones could be exfoliated and create new two-dimensional materials, which are, of course, besides graphene and other well-known two-dimensional materials. And they are been doing that with this high throughput computing, which requires very complex workflows. So in order to automatize this thing, of course, you cannot do it by hand. You have to have informatics tools that allow you to do that. But they have been building tools that people are using to systematically explore the materials in a very automatic way, so that you can get, for instance, band structures for the electronic structures or the phonon structures very easily and automatically. And with that, they have discovered some new materials that were not previously synthesized or obtained experimentally, with very interesting properties, topological insulators, materials with high electron hole mobilities, ferromagnetic materials for spintronics. I mean, many things that it would have been quite difficult and timely to develop from experiments. So Something that I wanted to mention also, I think this is going to be mentioned by the next speakers, is that besides these traditional approaches of doing science, theory, experiment, and simulation, now simulation can also serve, well, both simulation and experimental data and theory can serve to have a new paradigm of material discovery, which is collecting and sharing huge amounts of data that we are generating both in experiments and in theory. And putting that together with machine learning and artificial intelligence, you can really make a leap in the search of materials based on all this data and combining that into knowledge which was previously really not reachable. And with that, I finish, and thank you for your attention. I will be glad to participate in the discussion later. Thank you. Yeah, stop sharing.
Okay, thank you, Pablo. That was a great introduction and also gives us a lot of material to discuss implications. We won't take questions with each speaker. If you can hold them, we will have a long and open question time at the end. So it's my honor now to ask Professor Amanda Barnard, who has driven the area, particularly in Australia, if you would like to share with us. Amanda, and I've also had the privilege of working with Amanda in the old days when we were both part of CSIRO. So thank you very much, Amanda, for joining us today and giving us your wisdom.
Thank you, Ivan. And to everyone, I was at CSIRO for many years with Ivan, and then joined Australian National University, which is in the lands of the Ngambri and the Ngunnawal people. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the methodologies, really, and talking conceptually about how to think about choosing the right computational technique for the job, moving from modelling, which we've just heard some things about, to machine learning, and how they're different, and how you can think about choosing the method, but also how you communicate results. So I will admit I'm in the School of Computing and the School of Materials. But I use both modelling techniques, both simulation and machine learning in my research. Let's click forward. There we go. So the two different techniques that we use in this space, I'm referring to as simulation and informatics. In computing, they're both called modelling. But simulation is fundamentally a bottom-up approach. This makes it different to materials informatics, which is a top-down approach. With a simulation, we put in some knowledge of the problem or the system, we run the job, we get data. With informatics, we can take the data, we run the model, and we get some new information about the system or the problem. Simulations fundamentally are based on rules. They're based on the theories and the science, and as we heard just now, some of them were too complex to solve for many years before the advent of high-performance computing. Informatics, however, is based on experiences and history, and so in a lot of ways, the techniques and the thinking around informatics has been around for a lot longer. Simulations, although there are exceptions, are largely deterministic, and that gives them a lot of power. Informatics, although there are exceptions, they're also largely stochastic. That means we have to think carefully about the kind of solutions that we get. Simulation is exceptionally good at extrapolating, very useful in materials research. Informatics is good at interpolating, which can also be useful, but give you a different kind of bit of information. Simulations use an if-then-else logic, whereas informatics uses an estimate, improve, repeat logic. This means if you put the wrong input information into a simulation, it probably won't work. But if you put the incorrect information into informatics, it will give you an answer. And you can improve upon that, but it's not necessarily going to be correct. A big difference is that simulations in materials are interdisciplinary. They've been derived based on the rules and based on the expertise that either includes materials scientists or physical scientists, or at the very least, has involved them in the process. Informatics has been developed as interdisciplinary because it's largely developed by statisticians, data scientists, and computer scientists without the input from the domain knowledge from anyone in the application areas such as materials. And finally, simulations relies on human intelligence. whereas informatics relies on artificial intelligence. And these both give us something very valuable when we're thinking about what materials we're trying to explore, but also what we might use them for and how to translate them eventually from lab to the factory. Human intelligence gives us creativity. It gives us subjectivity. We can decide, we can make a judgment call. It allows us to make trade-offs or to think practically about what methods and instruments we might have down the track in terms of translation. It'll enable us to take risks. We could also ignore the advice and take in our personal preferences, and sometimes we make mistakes and we might put in the wrong things in the simulations, and we learn something from that. Most importantly, simulations and that sort of computational modelling approach allows us to really use our domain knowledge and to explore new ideas in a way that a lot of machine learning methods restrict us from. Artificial intelligence gives us something entirely different. These are a lot of the characteristics of us as humans, but they're exceptionally good at perception, representation, language and learning, optimization and planning, probably better than we are. Machine learning in particular is something that was developed in the 1950s with the advent of computers, and it's valuable because it effectively allows computers to program themselves. Before the advent of machine learning, in order to solve a problem in materials, calculating the materials property, we needed to know the form of the equation. We needed to know the model before we could solve it. With the advent of machine learning, we can now develop the structure of the model at the same time as solving it. So this means it's given us an acceleration of the scientific method. But the same way, not all different types of simulations are the same. Not all experiments in the lab are the same. Not all machine learning is the same either. We have a variety of different approaches and techniques which all give us something different. Ultimately, they're all trying to find a good mapping function, but unsupervised learning looks for hidden patterns and representative data, which is regardless of the property. So here we're just looking at the structure, we're not worried about the properties. Supervised learning looks for relationships and trends where we're looking at either for classes of materials or we're looking for maybe a structure property relationship using regression. So here we are interested, we know something about the materials, and this is most useful when we're thinking about applications. Reinforcement learning is useful for finding hidden behaviours and strategies, and statistical learning, which is used far less in the physical sciences so far, is looking for hidden meanings and underlying causes. And so intrinsically, you can think about the different kinds of work we're doing in materials using either conventional simulations or experiments, and think there's probably a certain type of machine learning that's fit for purpose and others that are not. The statistical learning in particular, if we're looking for why something happens, not just how, then that's the way we should go. So being able to choose between these methods can be tricky. And firstly, we need to understand that none of them were developed with material science in mind. They make some assumptions about the way the architecture of the model, and so it has some limitations, disadvantages and advantages that mean that when we present it with materials data, we have some challenges. Firstly, for the most part, our data sets are small. Most machine learning assumes that we've got millions of instances or samples, not hundreds or even tens of thousands. We have very high dimensional feature spaces. So that means we do a lot of characterization, particularly if we're doing gathering our data using simulation. We've got the power of computers to help us characterize our samples a lot of different things. And machine learning assumes that feature spaces were relatively small. We have different physical dimensions in our feature spaces. So it's not just counting different kinds of humans or different kinds of money. We actually have things that might be an area, it might be a concentration, it might be a volume. And this makes it very difficult because they converge to infinities of different cardinalities. Our features have very high variance and variable variance. So this also creates problems for machine learning. We have dependent measurement uncertainties. We measure a quantity, but we also have an uncertainty that's associated with it, which we could use as another feature because that uncertainty has information, but they are dependent. So that creates a challenge. Our data sets are very imbalanced usually and highly nonlinear. We're only looking for very specific types of things in our simulations or experiments in material science. And those things don't happen very often, and this creates an imbalance. This is something that's also experienced in health, where we're diagnosing a disease and you don't want to have a lot of people with the disease. In our case, it's usually the good things, the wonderful property that we're trying to develop is rare and hard to obtain. Our information comes from different sources. We have different instruments in the lab, and we have different kinds of simulations and characterization that we've done, and we combine them all into the one data set. That's also quite rare in machine learning. Some of our simulations and experiments don't work, and so we have missing information. And finally, we actually do have characterization that evolves and changes over time. That's less a thing in simulation as it is in the lab, but materials decay. So the other thing we have to think about is, why is all this an issue? Is because it contributes to bias. And all of these things contribute to bias in one way or another, and machine learning amplifies bias. So if we're not thinking about the bias inherent in the kind of data that we're obtaining to lead into machine learning from our simulations, then we're likely to have answers that are more about our bias than about our materials. So even if we option for automatic feature extraction using deep learning, we still need to think about how we process the data, and also model selection and methods and data selection at the outset. First kind of bias we need to consider is model bias. This is not, because almost algorithms are agnostic to the type of training data, but there are algorithms out there that have been deliberately constructed to be biased and give prejudicial results regardless of the type of data set that you have. An example of this is in banking, where a bank might have developed an algorithm that systematically prejudices towards particular clients that might match their risk profile. But we need to be wary of those when using them in other areas of science, because they will systematically prejudice the result, and we can't adjust for that through data science. We have a number of numerical biases that we need to consider. These are sampling issues when we sample small data sets, sparse data sets, and we include our outliers. We also have distribution issues, as I mentioned, non-linearity, imbalances, and heterogeneity to consider. And other numerical biases come from these dimensionality issues, where we have non-normal, non-standard, and highly multi-dimensional data sets in materials. Each one of these can be overcome largely using data science and data processing methods, and these can be implemented prior to machine learning. However, the worst place bias comes from out of everything, unfortunately, it's from us. Researcher bias is the worst kind. We are constantly biasing what we do because we operate in a restricted sense. We can restrict the scope and only do certain simulations, gather certain data. That's selection bias. We only do different kinds of feature extraction or characterization of our simulations and our method based on the skill sets that we have available to us, or the software, and then it introduces evaluation bias. We find information bias is less of a problem in doing simulations, the variation between batch to batch or scientist to scientist, but some codes use double precision, some use single precision, and sometimes when you compile on different high-performance computers, you will get slightly different answers. We love thinking we know our results better than the computer, and so we're very good at labeling what we think the results mean, and that can be based on intuition, could be from reading the literature, but that's confidence bias. Attribution bias comes along where we decide, if I've seen a trend where maybe my material's property is really highly correlated with the temperature, that therefore it must be a temperature-dependent property, but it may not be. That's attribution bias. Confirmation bias comes into where we actually only generate the data to support a hypothesis, such as only looking at a number of different temperatures of a material and then saying we've got a temperature dependence in our property. That's confirmation bias. Availability bias is when we use familiar assumptions, probably from the literature, reading the literature, and reporting bias, where we take only our very best outcomes of our simulations or any of our experiments, and those are the ones we report in our papers, and we don't talk about all the times it failed, which is most of the time. So if we adjust our strategy towards doing our simulations, we can, in some ways, alleviate some of these biases and mean that the data that we're generating is more machine learning ready. So once we've done that, we're choosing the right approach. There is no one best method for all types of data or all types of material science. We first need to consider the science question that we're trying to answer, the nature of the problem. Is it unsupervised? Are we looking at pattern recognition? Are we looking at a structured property relationship? Or do we want an underlying cause? We want to think of the properties of the data set, not just the properties of the material and that we've characterized, to be able to determine what might be an appropriate approach. We need to think about all those biases. Obviously, the resources we've got available, these can be computationally very expensive, and the goals of the study. So here's two examples to let you know what I mean. Firstly, let's say that we've got, we want to select a machine learning method that might give us ways to maybe classify some different materials. So we've got a class that we want to determine the class of nanomaterials by mapping the structures into groups based on some kind of similarity from our characterization. We could use logistic regression. We could use a support vector machine, or we could use an instance-based method like k-nearest neighbors, or we could use a Kahana network known as a self-organizing map. Any of these would do the job. However, linear regression is obviously linear. K-nearest neighbors is nonlinear, and support vector machines can be linear or nonlinear depending on the kernel. So which one do you choose? Depends upon the data. Is your data linear? Linear regression is a parametric method. This means that the distribution is pre-prescribed, whereas support vector machines or k-nearest neighbors are non-parametric. That means you can use them on non-normal variables. That might be more appropriate. Both linear regression, support vector machines, and k-nearest neighbors are all supervised methods, which means you already need to know what your classes are, maybe based on domain knowledge. And then it assigns each of the materials to one of those classes, whereas SOMs, or self-organizing maps, are unsupervised, which means they can actually determine the classes at the outset and then make the assignments. Do you know your classes? Or are you needing to find out that as well? That helps with the decision making. Secondly, let's look at another example, more of a structure property relationship. Let's say that we've got some materials and we've got all of the structural features characterized, and we want to be able to map them to a particular property. And so we can use either something like a tree-based ensemble method, like a random forest, or we could use an artificial neural network. Both of them will do a great job. Both are capable of implicitly detecting all these nonlinear relationships and all the possible interactions based on our variables. Random forests are extremely flexible. They're less prone to overfitting and less sensitive to outliers, and they're very amenable to tuning. That might be an advantage. Neural networks, however, require less statistical training. They can also detect extremely complex patterns, but they come with a greater computational burden, and they can be prone to overfitting. They also require really a lot more data. So which one do you choose? Well, beyond the fact that neural networks might require more data, the biggest difference between these two approaches is interpretability. Interpretability is when we gain some insights into not just what is the prediction of a property based on the structure, but why is that the prediction based on the structure? This is distinct from applying method, where it gives us some understanding using, say, a random forest, actually the architecture of the model and how the different pieces of structural information were used to generate the prediction. This means intrinsically, it gives us some background information that we might be able to act upon. It also means we can defend the outcome. If someone asked us, but why is that the material? We would be able to explain why it is. And that's really important in materials design, where simulations and machine learning are being used to make investment decisions. When using this information to make the decision to move from the lab to the factory, or whether it's the right kind of material that we want to put out in the community, where people are going to want to know that it is safe, that it is cost effective, and that it is robust and will endure over time, or whether it's recyclable, or whether it's sustainable in many other ways. So understanding how our predictions were made, as well as what the prediction was, is paramount, and not all machine learning will give you that answer. with that, I will leave it there. Throw back to Ivan and happy to take questions later on.
Thanks very much, Amanda. That was lovely, and actually explained quite a few things to me too. So I'm very grateful. And also, I'm actually amazed at how well this is flowing. I knew we had 3 world-class speakers, but we're actually flowing logically through the different approaches to machine learning and going from the hard crunching of numbers with DFT to the more flexible machine learning approaches. And our next speaker, Professor Winkler, will take us deeper into the machine learning approaches. So thanks, Dave. Over to you now to complete our trio.
Okay, thanks, Ivan. When you're the last speaker, it can be a good thing or a bad thing. The good thing is that the previous speakers usually do a great job of laying out the background. The bad thing is that they might be saying exactly what you're going to say, but fortunately that didn't happen. So I'm really grateful to Pablo and Amanda for really laying the groundwork for some of the things I'm going to talk about. So one of the things that hasn't been talked about so much, I guess, is what the major disruptive trends that are impacting chemistry, and I guess by implication materials science, that have happened maybe for the last decade or even longer. We're obviously seeing much more automation and robotics to do chemistry and property testing. There's a huge increase in the amount of data that's being generated, and I'll go into that a bit more later on. And as we've just heard, machine learning is growing in stature because of this increase in data to be able to model and understand molecular properties of materials and small molecules. And certainly in the last 5 years, we've seen a massive increase in the number of machine learning algorithms and architectures that are being deployed all over the place. I mean, we've seen this not only for chemistry, but almost every human endeavor has had to some extent either artificial intelligence, deep learning or whatever. And now we're starting to see inroads into quantum mechanics, where you can actually start to simulate some very high level quantum mechanical calculations with machine learning methods that can give you almost equivalent accuracy, but orders of magnitude faster. I'm not going to talk about that today, but it's obviously very relevant to materials. As we've heard, machine learning models can help, particularly if they're interpretable models, to understand the relationships between the structure of the material and the property that you're interested in, and you can use that to design better materials. But some of these recent deep learning algorithms, like GANs and encoder-decoder networks and so forth, you can actually build a model, and then you can get the deep learning algorithm to invert the model and actually tell you exactly what sort of molecule or material may have a better property, which is a fairly new paradigm, but it's something people have been trying to do since the 60s when these approaches were first developed. There's also been a massive increase in online synthesis and testing services, and the number of libraries now of materials like Zinc 22 just came out recently. There's over 30 billion molecules that potentially could be ordered and tested. This tends to be small molecules, but you'll probably see a growth in materials as well. And something I've had an interest in for a number of years is perhaps the next stage of where, AI really has been talking about machine learning, but AI has a lot of other components, and one of which is evolutionary algorithms, where you can actually evolve a molecule or a material towards one or more bespoke properties that you like the material to have. And of course, once you put all that together, if you've got evolutionary methods, you've got machine learning methods, you've got robotic systems, then people are now starting to build this so-called autonomous chemists, where you combine all those together and you can basically give this autonomous chemist some initial sort of lead materials, and you can say, I want these materials to evolve towards this one or more properties, and the autonomous chemist can basically go away and try and find you that automatically without a human in the loop. So that's a kind of perhaps slightly futuristic thing, but it's actually starting to happen now. I'm going to talk about chemical space. It's one thing that hasn't been mentioned yet. I'll discuss this in a moment, but we're really playing in a palette of almost infinite number of possibilities. And of course, we've heard there's been this massive Moore's law and beyond increase in computing capabilities. So that's been driving a lot of the innovations, I guess, in material science and of course in small molecule science like drug discovery and so forth, and in biology for that matter. And we've seen a number of new paradigms, which most people are probably familiar with deep learning. You've had things like AlphaFold, where, you know, I guess the holy grail was to be able to say, I can predict a structure of a protein, which is an extremely complicated material, simply from its sequence. And of course, everyone's probably familiar with ChatGPT, which is these large language models where they can do some quite incredible things. But as Amanda was saying, bias is important. What you're training these things on is really important. And if anyone's played with those things, like for instance, I got it to do a short biography of me, and it looked really, really plausible, but it really had nothing to do with anything that I've actually done in my life. So that was obviously quite biased. Okay, getting into the spaces we're working in. If you think about the human genome with 3 billion base pairs, you know, the space that potentially could map out to ideally is some absolutely astronomical number. If you look at protein spaces, it's a slightly smaller astronomical number, but still effectively infinite. You have a typical protein with 200 residues and you've got 20 amino acids. And material space has been estimated to be somewhere around 10 to the 100, but who knows? And you need to bear in mind, of course, that people have estimated the number of observable particles in the universe is only 10 to the 80. So effectively, we're playing in spaces much larger than the actual physical universe. So that's a great opportunity because there's almost going to be an almost infinite number of materials and molecules that we could find that might do absolutely incredible things and solve all sorts of major problems that we have in the world now and in the future. But because these spaces are so huge, how do you kind of navigate through these spaces to find these so-called islands of utility, so the materials that have the properties that you're looking for? So one way, of course, is to work faster, and this is where the automation and robotics has come into it. And so we've seen, obviously, like initially, I guess we had about the same time, we had the omics revolutions, but we also had combinatorial chemistry that was driven by the pharmaceutical industry, where instead of making one molecule at a time, they could make tens, hundreds, thousands, even tens of thousands at a time. And they thought that would be the holy grail and would produce all these wonderful new drugs. And it certainly has helped, but it hasn't been the panacea that people were looking for. Obviously, more and more robots coming into space. And when I, like Ivan and Amanda, worked at CSIRO for about 30 years odd, and just before I left, they'd set up this really lovely high-throughput materials laboratory called RAMP, where they could make hundreds or even thousands of materials at a time of all different kinds. They could be catalysts, or they could be nanomaterials, or whatever, porous materials. And that's a facility that's open to academics to use. If anyone is interested in doing that or they don't know about it, contact CSIRO about that. So all this together means that we've got this massive increase in chemical and materials related property data. And you can see there's been an exponential increase. Only went up to, well, I reckon by 2025, we'll have 160 zettabytes of data being generated. So we have this huge data lake. We can't possibly make sense of it ourselves because humans usually can't handle more than about 3 dimensions at a time. And as Amanda said, some of these models have hundreds or even thousands of dimensions potentially, although often much less because we use what's called a sparse feature selection method to reduce the dimensionality, which of course makes the models more predictive and also more interpretable. So that's what's driving everything. Just a bit of a definition, just in case people are not aware, that artificial intelligence is really like a superset. These are systems that can mimic the intelligence or behavior of patterns of humans. Machine learning is a subset of that. So as Amanda showed, we have computers that can learn from data. So we don't have to actually explicitly program every single step like we did when I was an undergraduate or a PhD student. But now you've got basically generic packages that can basically be trained on any sort of data that contains patterns, and you can pull the patterns out and make predictions from them. And deep learning is a subset of machine learning. So I didn't have this in before, but when I saw Pablo's slide, I thought I'd put a little bit of history in, because this relates really to maybe what I see as one of the new paradigms, the next paradigms in being able to evolve materials. Everyone's heard of Charles Darwin and probably Josiah Wedgwood, because Josiah Wedgwood founded the pottery firm, Wedgwood Pottery, which survived up until just recently. And Josiah Wedgwood was actually Charles Darwin married his cousin Emma Wedgwood, who's Josiah Wedgwood's daughter. And I guess in those days it was okay to marry your cousin. And I think Wedgwood, because he was a wealthy industrialist, he probably provided a lot of the funding for the Beagle expedition from Darwin. So there's a kind of a tie-in with all of this stuff. So back in 1773, Wedgwood was probably the world's first combinatorial materials scientist, I would say. Very, very long time ago, 250 years or so ago. He used to actually do these combinatorial experiments with pottery, and he would do he'd make lots of different variations of pottery formulae and fire them and test them to see which was the best. So I thought that was kind of really interesting. So this is something I got from Amanda a while ago, and I'm grateful for that, or at least part of it, and how things have changed back in the 60s, where this kind of structure property relationship was first developed by Hansch and Fujita, among others. Basically, he'd have a material, and then a scientist would sit down and try and figure out what they think the functional relationship between the parameters in a model might be. They might think a particular thing like a log P, for instance, so lipophilicity might be a parabolic relationship. So they'd have to infer what they think it is, write the appropriate equations and try and build a model. And then later on, as we heard, you can get the experimentalist or the scientist to generate either measured or calculated features, as Amanda was explaining. And then you can use some sort of machine learning algorithm, a neural network in this case, to build yourself a model. And then more recently, you've got deep learning. And as Amanda mentioned, one of the major features of machine learning is it takes the necessity to come up with the features a priori that you can use to train the model. And these things excel now in generating their own features and then building models from the features. And that can also be very useful for interpretation. And of course, they're very flexible. So this is just a few slides I'll flick through that you can train them on lots of different things. You can train them on small molecules. You can train them on genomic data. You can train them on, we've even looked at stem cell bioreactors, and we've trained models that can take the stem cell bioreactor properties and predict the outcome of the stem cells that come out of them. And of course, materials, you can put all sorts of materials, train the models with these. And the outcomes, things that you're training against, if you like, the dependent variable or the property that's being modeled, can be all sorts of things. I've just got some dose response curves here, some in vivo results from animal testing, physicochemical properties of molecules or materials, and even complex things like signaling networks and so on are amenable to machine learning models. So they're really, really broadly applicable. And this is really just a little pie chart I've got of basically my publications and all the different areas that machine learning, or I've been able to apply machine learning to. And on the right-hand side is just a list of some of the projects I've worked on, things like porous materials, 2D materials, stem cells, biomaterials, solar cells, surface analysis, cancer drug biomarkers, a whole range of different things. So I'll just give a couple of quick examples here, very, very quickly. So working with some people on a discovery grant, Joe Chapter's group, and people from the University of Melbourne and so forth, they've got a great interest in 2D materials. So we've got experimentalists making 2D materials. And we've got other people either doing DFT calculations or machine learning calculations to try and predict properties like the band gaps that control the electrical and optical properties of 2D materials. So one thing we did was active learning. So as Amanda mentioned, possibly Pablo as well, one of the problems is in spite of all these automated methods, which haven't really kicked in so much for materials, but you often have small data sets, which give you great limitations in machine learning. So one way around this without having to do a whole bunch of new experiments is a method called active learning, which was exploited in this particular 2D materials project we're working on. So basically what that means is that you build, you take your training set, you build a model from that, you're able to predict out into a wider space. And by doing the training multiple times, you're able to make predictions with error bars, if you like, in them. If you look at the materials that seem to be the worst predicted, you can then do a couple of experiments and actually measure the properties of those materials, add them back into the training set, recalculate the model and go around this cycle several times. And with not doing too many experiments, I think in this particular case, we made 6 additional materials. You can actually make a model that's got a much larger domain of applicability, which is the region of space where the model can make reasonably reliable predictions. So it's a way really of improving your models with a minimal amount of experimental effort, because experiments are expensive and time consuming and often very difficult. So if you can minimize the number of new experiments you have to do, that's good. Another problem we looked at was narrow bandgap photocatalysts. This is with the Rachel Caruso's group at RMIT. So what they're trying to do there is develop better photocatalysts for things like breaking water down into hydrogen and oxygen and things like that. So in this case, the Mac, who was the postdoc who was doing a lot of the work, developed these what are called stacking models or meta models. So the idea behind that is you have a training set and a test set. So the training set's used to build a machine learning model, and the test set is usually held aside and not used in training, but allows you, if you predict the properties of that test set, you can get an estimate of how well the model is predicting, at least within the space of the model. So the idea behind a meta model is that you can build a whole lot of so-called weak learners. So these are machine learning models. One could be a support vector machine, one might be a neural network, one might be a random forest, and they can all make their predictions, and those predictions can be used to train this so-called meta model, which is able to make a better prediction than any of the models that it was trained on. And that was used in this particular paper to come up with a pretty good estimate of what materials would be better photocatalysts. And then there's and this is just an estimate of how well the predicted band gap for these materials and the reported band gap, experimental band gap. You know, you can see the red points are the training set and the blue points are the test set, which weren't used in training. It can make very good predictions for that. And of course, you can then, as Amanda said, it's good to interpret this. So depending on the features you've used to build the model, you can go back and say, well, which features were the most important, which ones were actually detrimental to the property, and which features were beneficial for the property. And these, I guess these labels on the horizontal axis don't mean a lot, but they're basically related to a whole lot of atomic and molecular properties of the photocatalytic materials. So it can give you some insight as to how you can improve the properties of these materials, and also possibly how the properties that you're measuring or modeling, how they're related to the features. There's biomaterials here. I'm working with a group at University of Nottingham that I've been involved with for quite a long time. So what they've tried to do is to build polymeric materials. What they do is do high throughput experiments. So they make microarrays of polymers that are all different. And then in this particular case, they're interested in a coating material for implantable devices in the body that wouldn't allow attachment or had very low attachment of pathogens, because implantable devices often get serious infections. So if you can make a material to coat the device with that bacteria don't particularly like, then you've got a much better chance of it not having an infection. So in this case, I started with an initial microarray of polymers. I exposed it to 3 important pathogens in the hospitals and looked at which materials had high attachment, which ones had low attachment. They were able to build a machine learning model from that, and that was able to suggest how we should change the 2nd generation of polymers to be lower attachment. This is a kind of a combined machine learning and evolutionary algorithm approach. So on the left-hand side, you can see that panel of red and blue squares. That's really the microarrays of the polymers, and the colors represent the degree of attachment. And we want things that have got low attachment, so we want the things that are black or dark blue. So you can see in the first left-hand side, there's a lot of attaching polymers. In the 2nd generation in the middle, there's far fewer attaching polymers and much more that had low attachment. And when we went through this process the 3rd time to generate the right-hand panel, you can see there's a very large number of polymers there with very low attachment. And the graphs below just simply represent the machine learning models for the 3 pathogens for the training and test sets. And this was actually quite successful and led to some coating materials for catheters, I think, that have actually gone actually in the clinic now. And the 4th one is some work I did at CSIRO with Aaron Thornton and Matt Hill on trying to find porous materials, so-called MOFs, metal organic frameworks, covalent organic frameworks, and so forth. So these are porous lattice type materials that can be used for hydrogen storage, for energy applications, cars or whatever. And so we're trying to find materials that have a high storage density. So this again was a kind of a combination of machine learning and evolutionary methods, where Aaron was able to do what are called grand canonical Monte Carlo calculations. They're relatively expensive calculations to estimate the storage capacity of different MOFs. And because these are expensive calculations, he didn't do that many of them. He just scattered them through material space. We're able to build a machine learning model from that and predict which porous materials might be better. He then chose another selection of porous materials and did a scattering of grand canonical Monte Carlo calculations again. We fitted another machine learning model to that, made further predictions. And after 3 cycles, we're able to get to the optimum materials that had much better performance than anything we started with. So just very quickly, talking about where these technologies might be going and maybe societal challenges for what that's worth. And I say for what that's worth because probably most people have heard of this quote from Niels Bohr, that prediction is difficult, especially about the future. So anything I say here is probably not going to happen, or it'll happen more quickly or more slowly than what we think. But the interesting thing about this quote is it's only really half the quote. This is the bit you hear. The other half of the quote is, but I think mathematics will greatly change its aspect. So that's, I think, now what we're seeing is mathematics is greatly changing this aspect of making predictions about the future in materials. So just quickly, a few of the things that are happening now or likely to happen soon that are really quite exciting. So we've got the protein sequence to structure I mentioned before, this AlphaFold. Evolutionary methods, I think, are going to become increasingly important simply because of the size of material space, and evolutionary methods are about one of the most efficient ways of exploring very large spaces. I mentioned the fact that we can now have machine learning QM methods that can give you really nice answers with very short amount of time. The generative models I mentioned, where you can take a model and play it backwards to a molecule. There's a colleague in Glasgow and some others that are working on digitizing chemistry, so taking chemical reactions or materials reactions and turning them into a language, which if you could then do that, you could actually just drive a robot that could do the chemistry for you and get the same outcome every time, which is often not the case with humans. But you can now start to predict reaction routes. If you want to make a particular molecule or a particular material, you can use a machine learning model to give you a pretty good go at what a successful reaction is likely to be. I mentioned the autonomous systems that are starting to occur now, starting to work now, working with some people at University of Maastricht and so on and that. Make on demand libraries, I think, will be good because machine learning models can virtually screen these libraries and pull out things that can be made immediately, and you don't actually go to the lab to make all of them. And one thing I really won't talk about, but I think is really exciting, I've had interest in for a very long time, is systems chemistry, which is a topic of another talk, I guess. So, of course, I did not very much of this work as usual. So I've worked with a lot of groups. I try to work with experimental groups that can generate the data, but also on the proviso that if I build a model, they'll actually go and test the prediction. Because I think if you don't get people to test your predictions in the lab and see whether they're any good or not, it's probably not particularly useful. So I've always tried to do that. So these are the people I worked with, the 2D materials, photocatalyst work with RMIT, biomaterials largely at University of Nottingham, but some collaborators at Eindhoven and Maastricht as well. And the porous materials was sort of largely done, I guess, with CSIRO, but some Lawrence Berkeley people and so forth. So thanks for listening.
So thanks, Dave. That was great. And look, as I said before, really delighted about how the sequence of these talks fit together. We started off with the DFT and where it's to, then Amanda opened it up to machine learning and the different types, and then Dave, you've expanded it into evolutionary algorithms and explained to us a lot about how these things can be done quicker. You've also stolen a few of the questions I was going to ask, but that's all good. So that's a really wonderful sequence, you three. And as we said in the chat, we didn't actually coordinate it, but get three great people together and it just happened. So that's great. So let's now open up. We've got about half an hour, slightly less, for questions. They can either be technical questions or they can just be broader societal type questions. I have a few stacked in my pocket if I need to, but firstly, across the audience, please just mute yourself and ask. I was checking the chat. There weren't any questions actually on the chat. So anyone in the audience wants to ask a question, please go ahead.
Maybe just raise your hand on the reactions thing, might be easy.
Okay, Michelle.
Yeah, fantastic talks from all the speakers. I think probably one question I have is we can see there's a lot of applications for the modelling and the machine learning. Are there any bottlenecks with us being able to, move forward faster with what we're doing and where we're moving in this field? And how we might overcome those those bottlenecks potentially.
So why don't we start with Amanda and then move to Dave and then to Pablo.
From the computing perspective, I think there's a lag between the uptake of some of the methods that are used in computer science and that are under constant development, and a bit too much of a dependence on older methods that are maybe not fit for purpose. There's also seems to be kind of desire to use machine learning to replace something that could already be done quite well computationally. I guess do we really need to replace a pre-existing simulation method that gets fantastic results with machine learning that does exactly the same thing? That I feel is a waste of effort when there are things that machine learning does completely differently that we don't have a simulation that will do at this time. And so from a developmental point of view, that it's an opportunity to focus on that. But as I don't actually do any simulations, I don't know if there's a bottleneck there. Maybe the others can comment on that.
Okay, Dave.
I think the bottleneck, machine learning bottleneck is, there's two main things that drive the quality of the model and the predictions. Of course, the choice of the algorithm is important, as Amanda said, but that's largely between linear and nonlinear methods. But because, you know, if you're trying to model a nonlinear relationship with a linear model, it's probably not going to work. But the important things are the quality of the data, the quality, diversity, and span of the data, and the types of features that you generate to drive them or to train the machine learning models on. So I think for materials, for a very long time, and hopefully this is changing with the deep learning algorithms, it's been really hard to find material-specific features that are relevant and interpretable. And of course, for a long time, it's been hard to find enough data with the right diversity and quality and span to build models from, because the better the data is, the more diverse the data is, and the larger amount of it is, and the larger span that it has over property and material space, the interpolation and to some extent extrapolation, the domain of applicability of the model is larger, and therefore the model is much more useful and hopefully can make more reliable predictions over a larger space.
Thanks, Dave. I certainly concur. As you know, the work we've done together, and I've done separately, getting good descriptors and getting good data sets is really difficult in some of our fields. So hopefully some of these methods you've been taking us through might help with that. But someone that does do a lot of simulations, over to you, Pablo. Maybe just talk to this computer.
Yeah,
so that we
okay.
don't-
So from my point of view, from the simulation point of view, the main bottleneck has been the inverse problem. So it's quite easy and straightforward to simulate the properties of a particular material and to describe different properties of the material. But finding the material with the properties you need is something which has been traditionally very, very difficult. But that's changing a lot. I mean, with this machine learning thing and this high throughput computing, you are able to explore many, many different materials and find the one that has the properties you need. So there is a great advance in that recently. I think the main problem I see is, one of the main problems I see in this machine learning business is at least in material science, is the quality of data. So we are able now to generate massive amounts of data. I'm not sure if we are in the range that was mentioned before of the millions of data that we need for other fields, but we can generate thousands of data and 10,000s of data. But these are very different in quality. So people are actually gathering data that have been obtained by different groups and different materials and so on. And even using similar methods and even similar codes, you have error bars and differences in data from different groups and different times during history that it's very difficult to get something reasonable out of it. If you have dispersion in the data, then the machine learning will work much worse. That's something that Amanda was mentioning before. So I think that's a limitation in the field. You have now a few databases for materials properties that have been generated using computation, but the quality of the data is not sufficient. You need to have curated data which are homogeneous in quality, approximations, and so on. That's I think a major limitation in our field.
Okay, thanks, Pablo. Thanks, Michelle, for the question. Anyone else want to put their hand up, or simply just Dave, your hand's up. Do you want to ask yourself a question, or just want to add to
I want to ask the other two actually, because I mean it's just just a throwaway thing in a sense, but you know, quantum computing seems to be making some big inroads these days. I'm just wondering how far we are from bound to get if you like, a paradigm change in how we're doing things with quantum computing. Can anyone speculate?
I'll go. So from a computer science sense, it's not terribly interesting just yet. A lot of the capabilities already out there are quantum simulators, which are a simulation of a quantum computer if we had one. And so there's really not much for a computer scientist to do to profile that, because the profile is what you put into the code. The other aspect is that there's a lot of promise that it'll be faster, but they still have to be attached to classical architecture. So it doesn't matter how fast the switches are, and that's the fast bit. If it's a qubit, it will be a very fast switch. If we're still connecting them with InfiniBand, then the rate limiting step is InfiniBand. So there will be no change. What we need it to actually achieve for us is quantum supremacy, where they can solve a problem we can't solve now. The value of it is not that they can do what we can do now faster, because it'll always have to be connected to a wire, which comes to us in some form or another. It's the fact that hopefully we'll be able to solve problems that there's no other way of solving currently that only exists in cryptography.
Yeah, I very much agree with all you said. I think this may have an impact in maybe 10 years from now, but right now, I think its impact is going to be limited for very specific problems. So, for instance, in materials, the many body problem is an important one that could be tackled with quantum computing. But the design of materials, I think, is very far from being useful in this area. Yeah.
Okay, so we do have a question on the chat, and it's more of an educational question. So let me read it out. Understand not all material science absolutely needs machine learning. Do you think there's more that could be done at a place like the undergraduate level to inspire or build better and bigger and better foundations for machine modeling in the future? So certainly, as someone who's now doing some academic teaching, there is a very large gap between what we're talking about today and what we're teaching in the undergraduate level. So do we think this is a problem, and what could we do about it? So open to any of you, free to jump in on that one.
I'll just make a quick comment. I don't teach, the others probably do, but I know at La Trobe I've been really pushing teaching of machine learning because there was basically nothing in the undergraduate, and really learning machine learning is not really difficult. Sounds a bit esoteric and mysterious, but it's actually pretty simple when you break it down. Something you could easily teach in undergraduate. But I think now there's actually a focus on machine learning at La Trobe finally. The other universities have probably been doing it quicker. So I think it's something that we need to do better at undergraduate level.
Amanda, from the ANU perspective.
Okay, so I'm coming from the School of Computing, so our students all know how to do it very well. They learn it as part of their undergraduate degrees. We then do project work where it might be applied to a problem in materials. I've also had students that have come from materials background who then take on projects. And there's definitely a difference that could be addressed at earlier in an undergraduate level. If students know how to code and they're good at math, you can pick up the rest. If they already know how to code in Python and they already understand statistics, then they can learn the material science quite rapidly, and they can make progress quite quickly while they learn the material science. If they come from a science, and it's not just material science, but any kind of scientific domain area but don't know how to code, they can't make any progress for a very long time until they learn to code. Then the progress will come. So that's very frustrating for a student to have to go back and have all these fundamental skills before they can start to see some results in their project work. So I would say if we engendered materials students at an early stage with coding ability and stronger mathematics, they will be well set up to do well in the later years of their degrees or in postgraduate education.
Thanks, Amanda. And lastly, Pablo.
Yeah, so I'm not in a university, I'm in a research institute, so we are not very much involved in teaching. What we see is many students that really come with a strong background in artificial intelligence and machine learning. So they are actually introducing the topics in the groups of research. So they know how to deal with problems which can be solved with machine learning, and they are introducing these techniques in the group. So it's really great. They do have some training in the university, but many of them just learn by themselves. As David was saying, it's not really so difficult. So they are doing them by themselves. Yeah.
Okay, great. So let's back open the floor. We've still got about 10 minutes, time for a couple of more questions. Anyone want to put their hand up or just speak up? Well, I did have a few pre-prepared questions on societal impact, but you've all sort of asked them, but let me ask them anyway, just to stimulate the discussion. So we've heard a couple, well, obviously we have a lot of societal problems at the moment around climate change, climate impacts, around the circular economy, toxicity of materials, inadvertent impact of materials. We've also heard we've got all these methods, but we know that the traditional DFT methods are extremely slow and very costly. How can we start contributing to solving these major problems that we have when our traditional modeling methods are slow? And I think Amanda and David have almost answered this question, but let me ask it anyway. So let me start with Pablo, because he didn't have a chance to address that as thoroughly as Amanda. So how do we solve the great national challenges we have with molecular modeling, given the depth we need to go in and the slowness of some of our traditional methods?
Yeah, so one thing that many people are exploring is using DFT just to feed the machine learning. So you can develop machine learning potentials which have the same quality as DFT calculations, but then you can explore much longer time scales and much larger system sizes that are relevant in many problems. Like for instance, in electrochemistry, the time scales are nanoseconds at least, and in DFT you can achieve picoseconds and maybe tenths of nanoseconds. So that's a particular way to go in that direction. I'm sure that there are many more than not based on DFT. So yeah.
So Amanda, you did partially address it in your talk, but if you want to amplify solving grand challenges with molecular modeling methods.
Right. Also from the machine learning perspective. So there's the issue of time complexity. All machine learning methods and simulation methods have a certain time complexity. And so you've got to weight that against the value of the outcome. So some of the ways that scale horribly, with quantum chemistry as 10 to the power of 6, where the number of basis functions used to describe an electron. So it's huge. Machine learning methods also have time complexity about scaling around the number of features and instances. So that's something to choose. You can actually know that in advance and choose a cheaper method to approach your problem, depending upon your acceptable level of accuracy. Build in a fault tolerance, right? At some point, experimentalists have a fault tolerance. Why don't we have fault tolerances? There's a lot of effort into, simulations to feed machine learning that try to use as most accurate simulations as possible. But in machine learning, the statistical uncertainty of the entire data set will always dominate. So if you go to a higher level of DFT or quantum chemistry, all you're doing is improving the quality of the noise. You're not really improving the signal. So provided the method you're using gets the answer correct, then you don't need to go to more and more accurate simulation methods and expect that to improve a machine learning model. And so I think those are ways that, better decision making, which allows us to have an acceptable amount of risk and get an answer quickly. And then that narrows the field. And then you can focus more attention using the really expensive methods on the information that will really have an impact.
Okay, thanks, Amanda. Dave, do you want to add to what you already told us in your presentation?
Probably not per se, because I think the others done a pretty good job, but there's kind of a philosophical thing about societal impact that I just wanted to mention. About 4 years or so ago, I got invited to a think tank in Switzerland, and it was looking at the potential negative impact of these new technologies like CRISPR and machine learning and high throughput chemistry and so forth, both for criminal activity and maybe for nefarious governmental activities. It was run by the Defence Department. And I was talking about, the potential of machine learning algorithms for causing harm, because obviously they're very easy to distribute them. They're all over the internet. So the thing that worries me a lot is the use of machine learning algorithms generally in society, and that's behind most of social media. And I think there's starting to things like manipulate elections and stuff like that. So I think it's kind of a massive uncontrolled experiment we've been doing with social media in particular. We don't really know what the outcome is, and a lot of this stuff is actually driven by machine learning algorithms. So we just don't really know what the outcome is going to be. I find that a little bit scary.
I agree. Hopefully it's not going to happen to chemistry. All right, so a couple of questions. Totally new approaches to metallurgical processing to extract critical minerals from ores with major reductions in cost of processing. I'm thinking of catalysts as one example. Would this be a good application of this technology? So catalysts to change the way we do metallurgical process and mineral extraction. Anyone want to comment on that one?
I think there is quite a lot. I think there's quite a lot of research, particularly in catalysts, in anything that has a large search space. And there's definitely an opportunity to look for extraction methods. There's also, even experimentally, the instrumentation that is used to do the extraction can be automated, because there's different instrumental parameters that go into to a process like extraction. And machine learning can also do a better job of guiding that and monitoring those kinds of instrument parameters, so that when that goes off track, when it hits something it wasn't expecting, then it's self-correcting. And so that's something that can both do it faster, but perhaps also protect our scientists a bit more too.
Okay, thanks, Amanda. Pablo or Dave?
Yeah, I wanted to say something not really related to the last question, but more about the potential and the limitations of this kind of approaches. So one thing that is not very often discussed is that all these methods are very efficient and very, very good for, let's say, incremental improvement. So you want a material which works better than others, but it's kind of an incremental improvement. So the example of the catalyst I showed before is very clear. I mean, you have something which is a bit better than the other ones, maybe a bit cheaper, more sustainable, and so on. But you don't find disruptive solutions and disruptive changes. So one example is for instance, the high temperature superconductors. I mean, nobody would have ever been able to predict these materials with simulations, because they are so different from the materials we already know that you cannot predict them. I mean, you can find it by serendipity, but you cannot use these kind of methods to predict completely different behaviors of materials. So that's a limitation that we have in this field.
I'm not totally sure whether Amanda or Dave are going to agree with you, so that gives them the chance to say whether that's true, or maybe that's not true, some of the new advanced methods.
I think it's probably true at this stage. There's a lot of desire in most scientific areas to extrapolate and predict something that does not well explained by the training sets in machine learning. And so that's a huge motivation, and people try to use their models for that, but they really shouldn't. Generative models are capable of generating things that look like data. And can be and are being applied to some problems like this. But in some fields, such as astronomy, where they're a lot more advanced the materials in terms of using generative models, they've tried to generate new images of space, and it's complete crap. So it's generating things that look convincing, but there's no science there. And so it's very dangerous for us to be, without thoroughly doing a lot of testing and to actually be using generative models to generate things that we then claim are scientific. That's an area that needs a lot of work. So anyone that wants to jump into that problem, I think there's a huge opportunity in the future. But at the moment, I agree with Paolo. I think it's a no.
Over to you, Dave.
Yeah, I'd certainly agree with that as well. I think An example, going back to the mineral processing thing, it's not really my area of research, but I know the foam flotation method was developed, and it was an innovation at the time for getting for refining minerals and so forth. You can see an example there of this just been recently discovered. You could probably use some relatively high throughput experiments with different kinds of materials used to generate the foams that could extract the minerals more readily, and you could probably build a machine learning model of that, and it might allow you to optimize the process a little bit. But as Pablo was saying, it doesn't give you anything really innovative, and that's potentially where that might change with the evolutionary methods, because depending on what kind of mutation operator you have, if you just do a small sort of point mutation in the genome that represents a material, you're really exploring a local area of material space. But if you do a crossover type of mutation, then you can jump into a totally new area of material space, and that has a greater potential to find these novel solutions, and not just something that's an incremental improvement over what you've already got.
I'd just like to add in, Chair's prerogative. I think what Pablo and has been reinforced is correct, but not totally correct, because in my work with Pablo and the work you've done, Dave, you do find new molecular features that you didn't think are important are actually important. So to some extent it's still incremental, but it's much faster or much better incremental than that was happening without it. So we're not designing totally new molecules, but we are realizing that there are other features of the molecules that are important for what we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, incremental could still be an order of magnitude better, but it's not like 3 orders of magnitude better.
Hey, look, we've now come to the end of our time. If anyone has a last dying question they want to ask from the audience, you have about a minute to do so, but you are welcome to do so. So any last hands? If not, thank you for the 3 speakers. As we said, we didn't coordinate this, but we really moved through the field in a lovely, systematic way, and I really appreciate your free input. For myself, I've enjoyed this immensely. I've gained a deep insight and understand much better how we can fit these technologies together now. So thank you all, and thanks to the audience, and we really appreciate that. And we will put this up on the Materials Australia website for those members of Materials Australia, so other people can gain from your wisdom. But once again, thank you, and enjoy the rest of your evening.